Listen closely, and you can almost hear it, the faint hum beneath the marble, the heartbeat of a civilization that once shimmered with gold and sin. The low whisper of sandals brushing against stone corridors, of laughter, of moans, of silence pretending to be sleep. The city of Rome never truly rests. It exhales softly through its ruins, through its dust, through the ghosts that drift unseen between time and memory. Beneath its arches, beneath its temples and catacombs, the pulse of ancient pleasure still lingers. This is not the Rome of triumphal arches and military discipline, not the Rome of emperors or laws carved in stone. This is the Rome that breathed in candlelight and silk, the Rome of bodies and sighs, of power and surrender. To walk its streets at dusk was to wander inside a living body, its veins the narrow alleyways, its heartbeat the rhythm of feet, laughter, and whispered desire. The air would have been thick with perfume and sweat, olive oil and smoke, the sweetness of honey and something darker, almost metallic, the scent of life burning itself. From open windows drifted fragments of lyre music, laughter, and a single cry muffled by silk curtains. Beneath the order of empire, there pulsed a quiet chaos, the need to feel, to touch, to lose oneself. The Romans believed themselves masters of the world, yet the one thing they never conquered was the self. For even as they built monuments of marble, they built temples to the flesh. Pleasure, for them, was not escape but affirmation, a way to taste the divine in mortal form. They saw the act not as sin, but as ceremony, as dialogue with the gods, a reflection of cosmic balance. Venus, goddess of love and fertility, was not merely adored, she was invoked, embodied, worshipped through the joining of bodies and breath. Every caress was a prayer. Every moan a hymn. To touch another was to step closer to the divine, for the body was a vessel of power, of spirit, of transcendence. Yet beneath this sacred beauty, something darker moved. The Roman world was built on hierarchy, master and slave, citizen and stranger, conqueror and conquered, and that order extended into the realm of intimacy. Pleasure was not equal. It was an instrument of dominance, a theater of control. To possess another body was to affirm one's place in the world. To submit was to lose it. In their private feasts, senators and patricians reclined among dancers painted in gold, their laughter echoing against marble walls while servants poured wine that shimmered like blood. These were not the wild orgies of later imagination, but choreographed rituals, performances of hierarchy disguised as abandon. Each gesture meant something. Each position reaffirmed power. Yet, beneath the wine and music, a strange silence grew. The more they sought to perfect pleasure, the more it escaped them. The act became a shadow of itself, the thrill hollow, the ecstasy thin. The Romans, for all their mastery, discovered the great paradox of indulgence, that desire, once fulfilled, becomes emptiness. A nobleman reclines in his villa, surrounded by statues of gods frozen in acts of love and conquest. The air is heavy with incense. Dancers move before him, their skin dusted in gold. He sips wine, tastes honey, and for a moment, feels eternity brush against his lips. Yet even as he watches the dancers, even as he reaches for beauty, something within him falters. He feels the melancholy that always follows indulgence, that soft ache that no amount of pleasure can quiet. Because in their pursuit of sensation, the Romans stumbled upon a truth older than empire itself: pleasure is fleeting, and in its fading lies sorrow. Still, they chased it. They built baths that could hold hundreds, filled with rose petals and milk. They carved their desires into frescoes and mosaics, so that even the walls would remember. They whispered love poems in the shadows of temples, and in doing so, turned longing into legacy. For them, desire was not just lust, it was language. Every gesture, every sigh, every look held meaning. The body was not shameful, but sacred, and in its surrender lay revelation. But the Romans were never content with revelation alone. They wanted control. And in that hunger for mastery, of body, of soul, of pleasure, something divine began to decay. Sex became spectacle. Love became transaction. The sacred act was performed not for connection, but for affirmation. Power, wealth, dominance, all were measured in who could take, and how often. Beneath their poetry, beneath their devotion to beauty, the heart of Rome pulsed with contradiction. The poets knew it. They wrote of love as warfare, of passion as captivity. Ovid called it ars amatoria, the art of love, but even art can wound. In his words, one can hear both the seduction and the sorrow of a world that equated conquest with affection. To love was to risk humiliation. To be desired was to be endangered. Every embrace carried the echo of empire, its hunger, its cruelty, its longing for immortality. And yet, even in this darkness, something profoundly human persisted. In the crowded streets, in the baths, in the secret corners of villas, there were moments of tenderness that defied the order of things. A slave's hand brushed another's in passing. A soldier returning from war whispered a name he could not speak aloud. A wife lit a candle for a husband who would never return. For all their grandeur, the Romans were still people, fragile, yearning, afraid of the same silence that haunts us now. Perhaps that is why they built so much, not to display strength, but to drown the sound of emptiness. Their feasts grew louder, their temples grander, their nights longer, all to escape the quiet truth that lingered after the pleasure faded. That truth, that all beauty, all flesh, all ecstasy would end, was unbearable. So they sought to outlast it. They sculpted gods in their own image and worshipped themselves within them. But even marble erodes. Even desire dies. Stand in the ruins of Rome today, and the air still hums with their longing. The stones remember. The fountains whisper. In the mosaics of lovers entwined, in the frescoes hidden beneath centuries of dust, one can feel it, that pulse of wanting, that ache for meaning. They lived as though beauty could save them, as though the warmth of another body could outlast time itself. But time is merciless. It erases, it devours, it returns all things to dust. And yet, strangely, their hunger endures. We still dream of what they sought, connection, transcendence, the merging of pleasure and purpose. We still light candles in dark rooms, still reach for others in the night, still whisper the same prayers of touch and release. Rome may have fallen, but its desire did not. It lingers, in our art, our language, our bodies, our restless need to feel. The Romans never believed in purity. They believed in contrast, in pleasure and pain, in beauty and decay, in gods who loved and destroyed with equal passion. And perhaps that is what made their world so vividly alive. Theirs was a civilization that did not shy away from the shadows of the soul but embraced them, adorned them, made poetry of them. They understood that to be human was to live between extremes, between ecstasy and emptiness, creation and ruin. So listen again to the hum beneath the marble. It is still there, the sound of footsteps, of laughter, of the thousand lives that once filled the air with breath and longing. Rome's temples are gone, its feasts forgotten, its gods silenced. But beneath it all, in the dust and quiet, something ancient still whispers. A truth that is neither moral nor shameful, but simply human. The truth that the Romans once knew, and we still chase across centuries, that pleasure, in the end, is not the opposite of pain, but its reflection, a fragile shimmer of meaning in the vast, indifferent dark. In the stillness after midnight, when the city of Rome sank into its slow breathing, the veil between flesh and faith grew thin. It was then, in the hush between torches guttering out and dawn's first whisper, that the Romans touched the sacred in ways both beautiful and unsettling. To them, the body was not merely mortal clay. It was an altar. Every shiver, every sigh, every drop of sweat could become an offering to forces far older and more mysterious than any emperor. Pleasure, they believed, was not invented by mortals. It was inherited, a gift or perhaps a burden, passed down from the gods. When Romans spoke of Venus Genetrix, they spoke not of romance, but of origin. Venus was not just the goddess of love, she was the mother of the Roman people, their divine bloodline, their reason for existence. Her image stood in temples and in the hearts of courtesans alike, carved in marble and painted on the walls of bathhouses. To invoke Venus was to call upon the primal rhythm of creation itself, that sacred pulse from which both life and destruction flowed. And so, to make love was, in its deepest sense, to reenact the myth of beginning, the world reborn in the trembling of skin and the union of breath. But there was danger in that holiness. For when the body became divine, sin became impossible. And when sin ceased to exist, excess began to bloom like ivy, curling through every hidden chamber of the Roman heart. In the candlelit rooms of the Subura, the district of shadows and pleasure, men and women sought something beyond the limits of sense. The priests of Venus whispered prayers while dancers painted with oil moved slowly, their steps timed to the pulse of the heart. Their rituals were half worship, half surrender, meant not to please the body, but to dissolve it. To lose oneself so completely that only the gods remained. Outside, the streets murmured with life, merchants, beggars, children, soldiers. The sacred and the profane intertwined like lovers in the dark. A temple might stand beside a tavern, and within both, the same act would unfold, bodies meeting in secret, yearning not only for pleasure, but for meaning. In a world governed by fate, desire was one of the few things that felt chosen, personal, alive. And yet, even this freedom was bound by invisible chains, of status, of power, of expectation. A slave could not love as a patrician did. A woman's pleasure was often a reflection of her owner's desire. Still, in stolen moments, passion broke its boundaries, and something human flickered where the law could not reach. There were places in Rome where pleasure was not just permitted but sanctified. The temples of Venus and Priapus, for instance, were gardens of paradox, shrines of fertility where the air itself seemed heavy with breath. Offerings of flowers and fruit lay beside carved phalluses, crude yet holy, symbols of the life force that flowed through all things. To a Roman, such imagery was not obscene, it was elemental. The gods themselves had bodies, after all, and those bodies hungered. Jupiter's thunder was not just a weapon but an expression of virility. Mars' rage was passion turned to battle. Even chastity had its place, not as denial, but as power withheld, the energy of unspent creation simmering beneath stillness. In certain rites, women would gather beneath the moon to honor Bona Dea, the good goddess, whose ceremonies no man was permitted to witness. What happened in those secret vigils was whispered only in fragments, wine disguised as milk, songs that blurred the line between prayer and spell, and dances that carried women beyond their names and duties into something primal and free. For a single night, they ceased to be wives, mothers, daughters. They became vessels of the divine feminine, fierce, unrestrained, alive. To the outside world, these rituals were mysteries. To those within them, they were survival. Even the temples of Priapus, the rustic god of gardens and fertility, bore witness to Rome's uneasy marriage of humor and holiness. His statues, exaggerated in form, stood in courtyards and vineyards, guarding life with laughter. Offerings were left not in shame but in celebration, for to the Romans, the power of creation was not to be hidden but to be honored. The earth itself was sensual, breathing, eternal. And so the line between sacred and sexual blurred until it vanished. Yet as centuries passed, that reverence curdled into spectacle. The rituals that once sought transcendence became performances for the powerful. The feasts of Bacchus, originally moments of ecstatic union with the divine, turned into orgiastic displays of chaos and excess. The Senate tried to suppress them, fearing not the moral decay, but the loss of control. For in unbridled pleasure, there was rebellion, a dissolving of order, a reminder that every emperor, no matter how mighty, was still just flesh. The Bacchanalia, as they came to be known, terrified those who ruled, because they revealed the truth Rome wished to forget, that passion, once awakened, cannot be governed. In the quiet corners of villas and gardens, though, the older faith still lingered. Couples still whispered prayers before touching. Slaves still offered incense to Venus before lying with their masters. Even in the house of sin, ritual survived. And perhaps that is why Rome endured as long as it did, because even its pleasures carried the weight of eternity. Each kiss, each embrace, each sigh echoed the oldest truth of all, that life itself is desire. But not all desire is tender. There were darker currents flowing beneath the marble. The same power that could create could also destroy. Pleasure became punishment. Love became theater. In the palaces of emperors, seduction was weapon and spectacle alike. Nero, infamous for his indulgences, would stage feasts that lasted until dawn, his guests reclining in gardens strewn with petals, the air thick with myrrh and madness. Slaves and courtesans performed acts meant to blur the line between ecstasy and agony, devotion and humiliation. For the emperor, desire was a mirror, and what he saw reflected in it was both his divinity and his decay. In this world, morality dissolved like wax before flame. What mattered was sensation, and the control of it. Even the gods were invoked as accomplices. Venus, grant me the strength to feel everything, one poet prayed, and the wisdom to survive it. The Romans were not ashamed of pleasure, they were haunted by its emptiness. They sought meaning in it, built temples for it, drowned in it, and yet the hunger always returned. It was not the body they craved, but what lay beyond it, a glimpse of immortality through the trembling of mortal flesh. That is why their art endures. Their statues are not cold, they breathe. Their frescoes do not depict lust, but longing. The lovers painted on Pompeii's walls are not obscene, they are tragic. Their embrace is both divine and doomed, frozen forever on the edge of something they could never hold. When Vesuvius buried the city in ash, it preserved more than bodies, it preserved desire itself, caught in mid-motion, eternal and unfinished. To wander those ruins now is to walk through silence thick with memory. The beds, the graffiti, the murals, all speak the same language. I loved, one carving says, and in loving, I lost myself. These were not the words of decadence, but of devotion. For to the Romans, pleasure was not merely something to be taken. It was something to be offered, something that demanded a piece of the soul in return. And perhaps that is the unsettling truth that lingers beneath their marble calm, that what they sought in sex was not pleasure at all, but proof of existence. To feel, even briefly, was to know that one was alive, that the gods had not forgotten. In that trembling instant of release, they touched the same mystery that still eludes us, the fragile shimmer of being, suspended between creation and oblivion. So, when the torches dimmed and the city fell silent, the Romans did not dream of conquest or glory. They dreamed of touch, of the divine warmth that makes meaning of our fragility. Beneath their temples, beneath their grandeur, there lay a truth as old as time, that we seek in others what the gods once took from us, the sense that we are whole, eternal, unbroken. And perhaps that is why, even now, the ruins hum with their memory. The stones do not mourn, they remember. They remember laughter and tears, hunger and prayer, sin and sanctity woven into one endless rhythm. The gods they worshipped have long since fallen silent, but the yearning they awaken still breathes in us. For the Romans knew what we too often forget, that pleasure, at its deepest, is not indulgence. It is a kind of faith. It is belief that, in the touch of another, something infinite stirs, and for a heartbeat, eternity feels near. They said Rome was eternal, but its eternity was built not only on conquest and concrete, it was built on hunger. Not just hunger for land or gold, but for something that could not be conquered, the hunger to be seen, to be desired, to matter. The empire stretched across continents, swallowing cultures, languages, and gods, yet what truly bound its people was not marble or law but the invisible threads of desire that wound through every household, every forum, every feast. Power was not a thing held in the hand, it was a scent, a glance, a trembling beneath the skin. Every emperor, senator, soldier, and slave knew it, to rule another body was to rule the world itself. Rome understood power as something that must be performed. Its architecture towered like frozen muscle, its rituals demanded precision, and even in pleasure, control was the central art. Behind the draperies of villas, in the shadow of the Palatine Hill, the games of dominance played out in softer tones, whispers, gestures, silences heavy with meaning. The Romans turned pleasure into theater, and theater into proof of status. A noble's feast was not complete without spectacle, musicians, dancers, perfumes that clung to the air like invisible silk. To dine reclining was to remind all present of leisure, of victory, of the right to indulge while others served. Power was not simply exercised, it was tasted, inhaled, consumed. And so, even the smallest act of affection, the faintest touch, became a symbol of hierarchy. A kiss might not be love, it could just as easily be command. In the dim lamplight of a domus atrium, two figures might be seen, a patrician in embroidered tunic, a servant kneeling beside him, eyes lowered. Between them, the room holds its breath. The gesture that follows could be tender, or cruel, or both at once, and no one watching could quite tell. For in Rome, pleasure was not separate from power, it was its most intimate language. The patrician's control of another's body mirrored the empire's control of its provinces. To submit was not necessarily humiliation, sometimes it was a survival, a negotiation, a learned art of yielding without surrendering the soul. The Romans wrote of restraint and temperance in their philosophy, but in their private diaries and poems, they confessed to the fever beneath that restraint. Ovid's verses danced around the edge of scandal, whispering that love was a war of strategies. Even Cicero, moralist and statesman, hinted that control of one's passions was a mark of mastery, but control did not mean abstinence, it meant orchestration. One must rule desire as one ruled men, with elegance, precision, and the threat of chaos. Yet beneath the rhetoric of virtue, an empire trembled with contradiction. The very senators who condemned excess publicly might, behind closed doors, indulge in the same. Their villas were mosaicked with scenes of the gods entwined, their bedchambers decorated with frescoes that pulsed with motion even in stillness. There was no shame in such images. To the Roman mind, they were reminders of vitality, of divine inspiration. The gods themselves were sensual beings, Mars and Venus locked in their forbidden embrace, Bacchus draped in ecstasy, Priapus standing as crude symbol of abundance. The Romans believed that to deny the pleasures of the flesh was to defy nature itself. Pleasure was part of the order of things, as essential as harvest and war. Even the architecture of the city reflected this philosophy: open baths where nakedness was not scandal but social, gardens filled with statues that merged the divine with the erotic. The human form, sculpted in marble, was not hidden, it was celebrated, displayed, immortalized. But this harmony between pleasure and power came with a cost. The same sensual philosophy that elevated desire also deepened inequality. To own pleasure was to own people. The wealthy Roman could command the services of slaves not only for labor but for touch, for comfort, for company in the quiet hours of the night. These relationships blurred the lines between affection and coercion, between ritual and exploitation. Some scholars of that world whispered that Roman pleasure was a mirror held up to its politics, beauty masking violence, refinement concealing control. The empire's greatness depended on its conquests, and conquest itself was an act of violation, of borders, of bodies, of will. The feast and the battlefield were not opposites, they were continuations of each other. Both required mastery, spectacle, the display of dominance. Both ended with silence. In the baths of Caracalla, amid clouds of steam, senators and merchants mingled with philosophers and gladiators. Here, hierarchy softened for a moment, blurred by the haze of heat and sweat. Nakedness, for once, was equalizing. But even then, gazes betrayed rank: who was admired, who was ignored, who dared to look back. The Romans were masters of the gaze. They knew its power, its danger. To be looked at was both an honor and a threat, for the gaze could elevate or destroy. Desire was never merely private, it was always political. Who was desired revealed who mattered. Who could desire revealed who ruled. A freed woman could be admired for her beauty, yet never loved as an equal. A slave might be adored in poetry but dismissed in daylight. The poet's muse was often a ghost, idealized, unreachable, owned in words but not in life. And yet, within this structure of control, flickers of rebellion existed. Lovers defied rules, hearts slipped through the cracks of power. The same empire that glorified domination also produced tenderness, quiet gestures between equals, secret vows whispered behind closed doors, tokens exchanged in the shadow of danger. There were moments when pleasure became something else, not conquest, but communion. A recognition that in the act of touch, both giver and receiver dissolved into something shared, something that transcended rank or rule. The poets called it amor viris, true love, though they knew it was rare. Still, it haunted their verses, a ghost of possibility in a world obsessed with mastery. To understand Roman desire is to stand at the edge of a paradox. They sought to control everything, even ecstasy. Yet in that control lay their undoing. The emperor himself, crowned in laurel and gold, could not command the tides of longing. Power could build roads, aqueducts, and armies, but it could not silence the restless pulse of the body. And so, in their palaces and gardens, the Romans turned again to ritual. They offered sacrifices to Venus, prayed for fertility, for passion, for beauty everlasting. They carved her likeness into ivory, adorned her altars with roses and oil. They spoke her name softly, half in reverence, half in fear. For she reminded them that beneath all empire's glory, beneath marble and iron, they were still flesh, vulnerable, desiring, ephemeral. The cult of power thrived because it promised permanence in a world of decay. Yet pleasure, that most fleeting of sensations, whispered the truth, that nothing lasts, not even dominion. The Romans did not yet know it, but their pursuit of control, over others, over the body, over time itself, would one day crumble like dust between their fingers. For now, though, they danced at the edge of that revelation, blind to the fragility of their splendor. Their cities glittered, their feasts overflowed, and their hearts, though chained by custom and hierarchy, still beat with longing. The empire's greatness and its lust were one and the same force, the desire to touch eternity, to possess what cannot be held, to make beauty obey. And in the silence that follows a feast, when the lamps are dimmed and the marble floors gleam with spilled wine, one can almost hear it still, the sigh of the empire dreaming of itself. Power and pleasure, entwined like lovers who cannot let go, whispering through the centuries. Rome sleeps, but its breath lingers, heavy with the scent of roses, oil, and something more elusive, the ache of wanting, the memory of control, the ghost of desire that once ruled the world. When dawn returned to Rome, it did not burst, it seeped, slow and golden, through the latticework of stone and shadow. The city stretched like a waking animal, its marble bones creaking beneath the weight of centuries. The sound of fountains was the first to stir, the steady dripping echoing through courtyards and baths, mingling with the faint cries of merchants, the clatter of sandals, the song of unseen birds hiding among the cypress. In this early hour, when the empire's noise still slept, one could glimpse the fragility beneath its glory. The people who filled its veins, slaves, matrons, gladiators, lovers, were all part of a single, pulsing organism. And like any living thing, it breathed through its hungers. Desire in Rome was not a private thing. It was written into the stones, into the rituals of the household, into the very language of daily life. A Roman did not simply love, they aligned themselves with the cosmos through affection and command. The domus, the Roman home, was more than shelter. It was a theater of control, its layout designed to reveal and conceal in measured rhythm. The atrium, open to the sky, was where the master displayed his lineage and virtue. But beyond it lay secret chambers, darker and quieter, where statues of Venus and Priapus kept silent watch over beds perfumed with oil and wine. Here the masks of discipline slipped. Here the empire forgot itself. The Romans were masters of duality. They preached restraint and practiced indulgence. They built temples to chastity and filled them with the imagery of flesh. Their poets called desire a sickness, a divine fever that made mortals mad. Yet they sought it out as if madness were the only proof of life. The philosopher Seneca wrote that man's greatest challenge was to master himself. Still, even he confessed that temptation followed him like a shadow at noon. The empire was vast, but its heart, its truest frontier, was inward. Pleasure was the battle Rome never stopped fighting. In the quiet hours after banquets, when torches flickered low and musicians' fingers grew still, guests often lingered in the half-dark. Conversation turned from politics to philosophy, from philosophy to bodies. The Romans did not separate intellect from flesh. To discuss pleasure was to discuss order, destiny, the laws of nature itself. A senator might speak of virtue while his hand rested casually upon a companion's arm, testing boundaries the way generals tested enemy lines. Every motion was calculated, every hesitation observed. Desire was language, a grammar of looks and breath. It was how power learned to whisper. To the Romans, beauty was not only something to be admired but something to be owned, displayed, consumed. Artists sculpted bodies with the same devotion soldiers gave to their legions. To carve the curve of a thigh, the line of a hip, was to participate in divine creation. They believed that the human form was the God's most perfect invention, a reflection of celestial harmony. And yet, the more they chased perfection, the more human it became, flawed, trembling, mortal. The statues that lined their gardens, men frozen mid-embrace, women with drapery falling from marble shoulders, were more than decoration. They were mirrors. The citizens of Rome saw themselves in those still figures, caught between restraint and revelation. In the baths, that great equalizer of Roman life, men and women alike entered a ritual of cleansing that was as sensual as it was spiritual. Steam blurred the boundaries of rank. Senators bathed beside soldiers, slaves scrubbed the backs of masters. Voices echoed in the mist, laughter mingling with the slap of water against tile. Beneath the surface of this civility, eyes met in ways that defied class, defied speech. The bath was both confessional and stage, its heat loosening tongues, its anonymity allowing boldness. The Romans called it hygiene, perhaps it was confession, perhaps communion. But desire, like empire, demanded spectacle. Festivals dedicated to Venus, Flora, and Bacchus filled the streets with color and intoxication. Garlands hung from columns, music spilled into alleys, and masks turned strangers into lovers. For one night, the rigid structure of Roman virtue dissolved into something wilder, freer. Men dressed as women, women drank like men. Boundaries blurred, and for a fleeting moment, the city became what it feared most, equal. The poor mingled with the noble, slaves danced beside their masters, and laughter replaced law. Yet when dawn returned, the masks were lifted, the togas straightened, and the illusion ended. Rome could flirt with chaos but could not marry it. Order, always, reclaimed its throne. Still, something of that chaos lingered. It whispered in the corners of villas, in the memory of touch, in the way the morning light fell too softly on abandoned wine cups. The Romans spoke of these nights in cautious tones, pretending they had merely observed. But the memory of release haunted them. Beneath their marble temples, beneath their laws and hierarchies, there was a yearning they could not silence, the longing to lose control, to surrender the very thing they worshipped most, dominance. And so, their pursuit of power became the pursuit of pleasure in disguise. To conquer was to touch, to own was to be desired. Even the empire's expansion across the Mediterranean was spoken of in sensual language: lands seduced, cities taken, peoples tamed. It is easy to imagine Rome as a place of arrogance and discipline, but to stand among its ruins is to feel something else: vulnerability. Each column, each crumbling bath, each fragment of fresco depicting intertwined bodies tells the same story: a civilization trying to make permanence out of transience. The Romans loved as they built, with ambition, with fear, with the desperate hope that beauty might outlast decay. They could conquer nations, yes, but they could not conquer time. Pleasure was their rebellion against that truth. Every embrace, every feast, every whispered vow was an attempt to deny the slow collapse that awaited all empires, all lovers, all bodies. And in this way, the cult of power became indistinguishable from the cult of pleasure. To be powerful was to command desire, to be desired was to feel powerful. It was a circle with no escape. The emperor himself, seated upon a throne of ivory and gold, was as much a slave to adoration as any of his subjects. When the people cheered his name, he shivered with the intoxication of being wanted. The poets would later say that Rome did not fall because of decadence, but because it mistook longing for love, obedience for affection. In the end, every empire that worships control must face the same fate: it becomes prisoner to its own desire. Night returned to Rome not as darkness, but as a slow descent, a curtain drawn across the marble face of empire. The torches flickered to life, staining the streets with their orange glow, and the hum of the city shifted from labor to longing. What began in the marketplace ended in the whisper of wine cups, the soft clatter of jewelry, the faint music drifting from courtyards where shadows danced in pairs. Rome was a city that never truly slept, it merely changed its mask. By day, it was order and rhetoric, marble and decree. By night, it became breath and confession, a pulse made visible. In the narrow lanes beneath the Palatine, the scent of oil lamps mixed with that of figs, myrrh, and sweat. Courtesans lingered at the doorways of dimly lit houses, veiled in gauze and mystery, their laughter echoing like chimes against the stone. They were not merely bodies for hire, they were artisans of illusion, fluent in the language of power. Each glance was a negotiation, each smile, a trap. Men of letters and soldiers of fortune alike came seeking something that gold alone could not buy: the feeling of being seen, of being chosen. In a world defined by conquest, to be desired was a small rebellion against death. These courtesans, some freed women, some foreign, some still enslaved, were both worshipped and condemned. Roman poets wrote of them with equal parts lust and loathing. They were said to be dangerous because they understood what even emperors feared: that the greatest power lies not in domination, but in the ability to evoke surrender. Within those dim chambers, the usual hierarchies dissolved. The man who commanded legions might kneel, the philosopher might forget his virtue. And when morning came, they would all return to their roles, pretending nothing had been unmasked. But the women remembered. The power they wielded was not written in law or lineage, it lived in the trembling silence after the last candle was extinguished. Even the gods reflected this balance between dominance and devotion. The cult of Venus was not a simple worship of beauty, it was a meditation on transformation. To honor her was to acknowledge that power, like desire, was fleeting. Her temples were filled with votive offerings, rings, carvings, small clay figurines of lovers entwined. Soldiers prayed to her before battle, not for victory, but for the courage to return home whole. Women prayed for fertility, for affection, for the soft persistence of love in a world ruled by iron. Even the emperors built shrines in her name, perhaps knowing that their marble immortality could not protect them from the slow erosion of time, or from the loneliness of command. To live in Rome was to live inside ritual. Every gesture carried meaning, every feast was an invocation. The act of reclining at table, of breaking bread, of pouring wine, all were performances that reminded participants of who they were and who they must never become. The philosopher might debate virtue while the scent of roasted peacock filled the air, while a servant's delicate hands refilled his cup. The contradiction was not hidden, it was embraced. For the Romans, virtue did not mean abstinence, it meant balance, a fragile poise between indulgence and discipline. To fall entirely into excess was shameful, but to deny the flesh was an insult to the gods. Moderation, not purity, was the empire's religion. And yet, the deeper one looks, the more fragile that balance appears. Behind every virtue lay appetite, behind every sermon, confession. In the house of the Vetii at Pompeii, its frescoes still alive centuries later, bodies intertwine in endless dance. The walls tell stories that words dare not. Lovers caught in motion, musicians mid-song, faces serene in their abandon. These were not meant for the eyes of strangers, yet they endure, whispering to the modern world that Rome's truth was never written in its laws, but in its silences. The same hand that painted those images once lit the lamps beside the bed, once poured wine into a trembling cup. To study Rome's art is to touch its breath. The poets knew this too. They spoke of love not as purity but as warfare. Ovid wrote of strategy and surrender, of how to win the heart as one would win a province. His verses, banned and later exiled for their frankness, carried a dangerous message, that pleasure was knowledge, that the body was as worthy of study as the soul. Even in exile, he wrote of touch and memory, of how desire survives absence. His words outlived his punishment, just as lust outlived the laws that tried to contain it. There were others, men and women unnamed, who practiced subtler forms of rebellion. A matron who sent secret letters to her lover disguised as hymns. A slave who sang softly in Greek to his master, knowing the melody meant freedom. A soldier who refused to take a concubine, choosing instead the quiet loyalty of another man. These moments never entered the annals of history, but they shaped the empire's pulse more than any decree. Beneath the marble surface of Rome, desire flickered like an underground fire, reshaping everything it touched. To walk through the ruins now is to feel the ghost of that fire. The baths are silent, the mosaics cracked, but their beauty hums like a memory that refuses to fade. You can almost imagine the water's steam rising again, the laughter echoing through the vaulted ceilings. You can almost feel the heat of the bodies that once filled these spaces, alive, flawed, seeking. Their stories did not die, they sank into the stone. And what remains of that empire, really, but the memory of longing? Its conquests turned to dust, its rulers forgotten, yet its hunger, the desire to reach beyond itself, to hold the ephemeral, still breathes in us. We, too, build monuments to control what we cannot keep. We, too, mistake possession for love, performance for truth. Perhaps the Romans were not decadent but merely honest. They did not hide from their contradictions, they lived them. They understood that power and pleasure are twin forces, bound by the same gravity. Both promise eternity, both end in silence. As the last torch gutters in the wind and the city sinks into sleep, Rome becomes a whisper once more. The marble cools, the fountains murmur, and the moon casts its pale hand upon the stones. Somewhere, far below, in the ancient dust, the faint echo of laughter lingers, gentle, haunting, eternal. The empire of the body and the empire of power merge into one dream. And when morning comes, that dream will rise again, golden and trembling, pretending it has forgotten the night. They said the gods watched everything, yet in Rome, the gods did not judge. They hung in marble silence above the people, their stone eyes patient, their lips forever poised between command and compassion. To the Romans, divinity was not distant, it was embodied, reflected in the curve of a statue, in the scent of incense rising from an altar, in the way light caressed the skin during prayer. The body itself was a vessel, a conduit between the human and the divine. Flesh was not shame, but scripture. To touch, to adorn, to anoint, these were acts of worship. The temple was within, and its rituals were written in breath. Morning in Rome began with ablution. The water was cold, drawn from fountains or clay jars, and it struck the skin like revelation. Each drop was a reminder that the body must be cleansed not from sin, but from sleep, from the weight of mortality. To bathe was to awaken the spirit that dwelled beneath the flesh. The faithful rubbed oil into their limbs as priests burned offerings of myrrh and frankincense nearby, their smoke rising like invisible hymns. The fragrance mingled with the morning air, sweet, sharp, slightly bitter, as if reminding those who breathed it that beauty was never without pain. Even the act of grooming, of combing the hair or binding it in gold thread, carried sacred weight. The Romans believed that to present the body well was to honor the gods who had shaped it. Neglect of appearance was not humility, it was ingratitude. The rituals of devotion in ancient Rome were as much physical as spiritual. In the temples of Venus, priestesses moved in patterns older than language. Draped in sheer fabrics that shimmered like water, they danced not for spectacle but for invocation. Their movements traced invisible symbols in the air, each step an offering, each breath a chant. To watch them was to glimpse something both erotic and divine, an art of surrender that blurred the line between holiness and desire. The citizens who gathered at these rituals did not come merely to watch, they came to feel. As the music of flutes and drums echoed through the marble halls, the crowd swayed unconsciously, as if their bodies remembered some forgotten rhythm. It was said that when Venus herself was pleased, the flames of the altar flickered in rhythm with the dancers' steps. But not all gods demanded beauty. Some required endurance. The cult of Cybele, the Great Mother, called for devotion through suffering, through blood, through noise, through frenzy. Her priests, the Galli, renounced their former selves, their voices high and trembling as they beat drums and clashed cymbals in ecstatic trance. In their rituals, the body ceased to belong to the self, it became a vessel for the goddess. To outsiders, it was madness, to the faithful, it was transformation. The Romans watched with fascination and fear. In these rites, they saw the shadow of their own hunger, the yearning to be consumed by something greater than reason. For though they prized order, they were drawn irresistibly to chaos, to the idea that salvation might lie not in control, but in surrender. There was no contradiction, they thought, in honoring the gods through pleasure. The festivals of Bacchus, god of wine and ecstasy, proved as much. Under his gaze, wine flowed like water, and restraint was forbidden. In the torchlit groves beyond the city, the faithful gathered in secret, their laughter echoing through the dark. They drank until the world dissolved into movement and sound, until the body forgot its boundaries. Men and women alike wore wreaths of ivy and skins of panthers, calling out the god's name as they danced barefoot in the earth. The Bacchanalia were not simply orgies of flesh, they were rituals of release, an attempt to strip away the false layers of civilization. To lose oneself was not sin, it was revelation. The Senate, terrified of this freedom, once banned the rites, fearing what could happen when Romans forgot to fear themselves. Yet even in prohibition, the worship continued, quietly, privately, in villas and countryside shrines, beneath the moon's indifferent gaze. The hunger for transcendence could not be silenced. Rome's soul, for all its discipline, still ached for dissolution. To understand the Roman view of the body is to understand their universe. They believed in correspondence, the harmony between microcosm and macrocosm. The body reflected the state of the world, disorder within mirrored chaos without. To heal one was to heal both. Physicians, philosophers, and priests shared this belief. They treated not only wounds but spirits. A lover's despair was an imbalance of humors, an unfulfilled desire, a sickness of the soul. They prescribed baths, oils, music, touch, remedies that were as sensual as they were spiritual. The body was not a prison, as later faiths would claim, it was a temple whose sanctity required care. In the sanctuaries of Asclepius, the god of healing, the sick slept beneath frescoed ceilings painted with stars. There, they awaited dreams that would reveal their cure. The priests walked among them, whispering prayers, burning herbs, laying hands upon fevered foreheads. Many awoke claiming to have been touched by the god himself, his presence felt as warmth spreading through the chest. To be healed was to be chosen, to be reminded that the divine resided not in heaven, but beneath the skin. Even death, to the Romans, was not a severing of body and soul but a continuation. The dead were washed, perfumed, adorned, prepared for their journey as though for a feast. Families gathered not in mourning alone but in remembrance, offering bread, milk, and honey at the tombs. The act of feeding the dead was an act of love, a reaffirmation that desire did not end with breath. In the quiet necropolises outside the city walls, incense curled above marble urns like whispers from another world. The scent clung to the living, reminding them that devotion, like pleasure, was never entirely pure. Perhaps the most striking truth of Roman ritual was this: the same gestures used to honor the gods were used to honor lovers. The pouring of oil, the binding of hair, the burning of incense, acts that sanctified both altar and bed. The lover was priest and offering alike. To kiss was to pray, to touch was to invoke. Their language made no clear distinction between sacred and profane. In the poetry of Catullus and Propertius, the body became the holy text, and the act of love, a liturgy. Even sin, when they spoke of it, was not guilt but imbalance, the excess of desire over harmony. The Roman world thus existed in a state of exquisite tension, torn between devotion and indulgence, between reverence and appetite. To the modern eye, their faith may seem strange, almost blasphemous in its intimacy with flesh. But to them, it was natural. How could one worship creation and deny its form? To look upon the beauty of a human face was to glimpse divine craftsmanship. To feel pleasure was to momentarily dissolve the boundaries of mortality. The divine, after all, was not distant, it was immediate, tactile, breathing through the same air. As night fell, the temples glowed with the soft pulse of lamplight. The air shimmered with the smell of burning oil, of flowers wilting in offering. Across the city, in houses and courtyards, the same gestures repeated: washing, perfuming, touching, praying. Each act mirrored the other, private and public devotion entwined. And somewhere, in the stillness between breath and word, Rome exhaled, its people, its gods, its desires, all woven into the same slow rhythm. The body, the temple, and the world, three mirrors reflecting the same unending flame. When the sun set over the 7 hills, the city changed its pulse. The din of the markets softened, and the murmuring of fountains became the city's heartbeat. From the thresholds of houses and temples, oil lamps flickered to life, small constellations that seemed to mirror the stars yet unseen above. In this half-light, between day's reason and night's mystery, Rome revealed its second self. The same bodies that toiled beneath the sun now moved differently, slower, deliberate, as if drawn by an invisible ritual. The night was not a time of rest but of reverence, for the gods, for the senses, for the unseen forces that govern desire and decay alike. It was at night that the city remembered its breath. The air carried the scent of jasmine and burning cedar. The sound of flutes drifted from courtyards where slaves prepared baths of steaming water. Water in Rome was not merely for cleansing, it was sacred. It had flowed through aqueducts from distant mountains, a gift of engineering and divinity. To bathe was to participate in both, the triumph of man and the grace of nature. The Romans entered their baths as worshippers, not merely as bathers. There were rules, sequences, small rituals, to move first from warm to hot, then to cold, to scrape the skin with strigils, to anoint with oil, to lie in the tepidarium where steam rose like incense. The sound of dripping water echoed in marble chambers, a rhythm that lulled the mind toward contemplation. In that silence, surrounded by strangers yet united by the ritual of care, the Romans touched something beyond pleasure, the feeling of belonging to a body greater than their own. The Thermae were temples in their own right, vast and luminous, lined with mosaics depicting nymphs, gods, and creatures of myth. In their reflections, water shimmered like living glass. Here, senators, soldiers, merchants, and slaves shared the same waters. Rank dissolved in steam, only the flesh remained. To watch the bathhouse was to see Rome's philosophy in motion, the body as equalizer, as sacred vessel. There was no shame in nudity, no secrecy in skin. The Romans believed that concealment invited corruption. To display one's body was to affirm life, to acknowledge the craftsmanship of the divine. Beauty was not vanity, it was virtue, an external sign of harmony within. And yet, even in this devotion to the physical, the Romans never forgot that beauty was fleeting. Marble could chip, water could evaporate, youth could fade. To preserve what could not last was itself a form of worship. Women adorned themselves with cosmetics ground from minerals, crushed petals, and the dust of pearls. Men perfumed their beards and hair with oil pressed from olives and almonds. To scent oneself was not indulgence but offering, a fragrance sent upward toward the gods. At every mirror, one might imagine a whisper, "Tend to the vessel, for it carries the divine flame." In the sanctuaries of Venus Erycina, the goddess of sensual love, devotion took the form of touch. Her priestesses received offerings not only in coin but in caress. To be with them was not merely to seek pleasure, but to commune with the goddess through the body of another. In their chambers, hung with veils of purple and gold, incense smoke wove patterns through candlelight. Every gesture, a hand upon a chest, the brush of lips upon skin, was ritualized, measured, sacred. For the Romans, desire was not to be feared or suppressed, it was a form of prayer, a reaching outward toward the divine that dwelled within another's flesh. When two bodies met, they believed, the gods watched, not in judgment, but in remembrance of their own creation. Yet the Romans also knew that devotion could twist into obsession. In the quiet corners of the city, cults of darker gods thrived, deities of shadow and secrecy, of thresholds and transformation. The followers of Isis, imported from Egypt, gathered by moonlight to chant hymns in languages half forgotten. Their ceremonies were sensual, veiled in mysticism, invoking rebirth through immersion in trance. To join their ranks was to be initiated into the hidden rhythms of life and death. In their eyes, the body was not only temple but tomb, a vessel that must be emptied before it could be filled with divine presence. Their rituals blurred the boundaries between pleasure and purification, between agony and awakening. In one such ceremony, initiates lay upon cool stone floors as priests poured water scented with lotus over their bodies. The chill struck them like revelation. The air hummed with low chanting, and in that sound, something shifted, as if the body, stripped of its will, became weightless, porous, open to forces unseen. When they rose, trembling and glistening, they believed themselves reborn. Rome tolerated such rites, for the empire absorbed everything, belief, body, and soul alike. Every god, even foreign ones, found a home in its marble veins. But perhaps the most intimate expression of this philosophy was found not in temples or baths, but in the privacy of the domus, the Roman home. The atrium, open to the sky, was itself a microcosm of the world. Rain fell into the impluvium, the shallow basin that mirrored the heavens. Around it, the family gathered, offered prayers, made libations. The Lares and Penates, household spirits, watched from their shrines, small figurines of bronze or clay, reminders that even the hearth was sacred ground. Before meals, a few drops of wine were poured onto the floor, an offering to the unseen. To eat, to drink, to lie beside one's lover, all were acts of reverence. The home, like the temple, pulsed with invisible holiness. There were other, stranger rituals too, small customs preserved from the city's ancient past, when the line between superstition and faith was thin. On certain nights, women would anoint their doorframes with oils and hang garlands of flowers mixed with garlic to ward off spirits of lust that wandered the streets. On the feast of Vesta, virgins tended the sacred flame that symbolized the purity of Rome itself. Their lives were devoted to chastity, yet their duty was one of fertility, a paradox that reflected the city's own nature, restrained yet yearning, disciplined yet indulgent. The Vestals were the keepers of continuity, their untouched bodies serving as vessels for the state's endurance. But even they, the purest of Rome's daughters, were not immune to whispers of temptation. More than one Vestal was buried alive for breaking her vow, entombed with oil, water, and a small lamp, to keep her company as the light of her life slowly dimmed. Still, for every act of punishment, there was worship. For every suppression, a secret indulgence. Rome's greatness lay not in uniformity but in its contradictions. The same society that exalted virtue celebrated sensuality, the same culture that honored discipline adored abandon. They believed that the gods themselves embodied such dualities, that Jupiter could be both ruler and lover, Mars both destroyer and seducer. To emulate the gods, then, was not to be pure, but to be complete, to experience the full spectrum of the divine through flesh. Among philosophers, this understanding took subtler form. Stoics like Seneca taught that pleasure must serve reason, that the body was not to rule but to obey the mind. Yet even they did not condemn pleasure outright. To deny the body entirely was to deny the natural order. Epicureans, on the other hand, saw pleasure as the highest good, but not the hedonistic kind, rather, the calm pleasure of balance, the peace that came from moderation. To eat simply, to love honestly, to rest in quiet, these were their prayers. Rome's intellectual life, like its spiritual one, danced on the edge between control and surrender. As the empire expanded, so too did its rites of flesh. In the provinces, Roman soldiers brought their customs, the baths, the altars, the festivals, blending them with local traditions. In Gaul, Venus took the name of Celtic goddesses. In Egypt, Isis wore Roman jewels. The faith of the body spread, morphing, adapting, absorbing. Even the conquered learned to kneel before Rome's invisible pantheon, not with fear, but with fascination. For the Romans had built a religion not of commandments, but of sensations, of marble, wine, touch, and scent. In time, however, shadows began to gather. A new voice rose in the east, one that spoke of sin, of salvation, of the Spirit's supremacy over flesh. To some, it was liberation, to others, an annihilation of everything Rome held sacred. But that story belongs to another chapter, one where temples would crumble and the language of the body would be rewritten. For now, in the candlelit stillness of the empire at its height, the old faith still breathed. If one stood then on a Roman balcony at dusk, one might see it, the flickering of lamps across the city, the faint music of distant hymns, the murmuring of fountains. Below, lovers passed beneath colonnades, their steps echoing softly in the stone corridors of eternity. The air was warm with oil and promise. Every sound, every scent, every heartbeat seemed to say the same thing: the body is not prison, but prayer. And as the night deepened, and the stars shimmered faintly above the domes and temples, Rome exhaled again, slowly, reverently, as though in rhythm with the pulse of the universe itself. In that breath lingered the memory of every ritual, every touch, every whispered name of the gods. The city slept, but its temples, the stone ones, the flesh ones, continued to glow. Power, in Rome, was a language written upon the body. It was not spoken in words alone, nor even in deeds, but in the subtle choreography of gaze, gesture, adornment, and restraint. The empire was a theater of seduction, not merely of lovers, but of rulers, generals, senators, and gods. Desire was not the enemy of authority, it was its instrument. To command was to seduce, and to seduce was to rule. From the polished marble of the Senate to the shadowed corners of imperial chambers, the currents of lust and ambition intertwined like twin serpents coiled around the same staff. Rome did not simply conquer with the sword, it conquered with the eyes. From the earliest kings to the last emperors, the spectacle of power was erotic. The triumphal processions that thundered through the streets were not only displays of military might but of sensual grandeur. The conqueror, draped in purple, the color of blood and luxury, stood upon his chariot like a god among mortals, his muscles oiled, his posture divine. Around him, captives were paraded, their forms half-naked beneath golden chains. The crowd's gaze lingered not only on the victor but on the defeated, on the curve of limbs, the glint of sweat, the trembling bodies made symbols of submission. Power, to the Roman eye, was a spectacle of bodies, one in command, the other surrendered. But beneath this display lay a deeper, quieter truth: in Rome, seduction was not limited to flesh. It was persuasion itself, the art of bending others to one's will through beauty, intellect, or charisma. The orators of the Forum were as much seducers as the courtesans of the Subura. Their words flowed like wine, intoxicating the masses, making men weep, rage, and follow. Cicero, with his eloquence, was said to undress the minds of men. To listen to him speak was to feel a strange, involuntary surrender, as though reason itself desired him. In that sense, rhetoric and eros shared a single pulse, both sought entry into another's interior world. The same alchemy unfolded in politics. A senator's gesture, a glance exchanged during a feast, a calculated pause in conversation, all were moves in a dance as intricate as any lover's seduction. The banquet table became the empire's bedchamber, where alliances were conceived and betrayals born. Reclining upon couches draped in silk, the powerful ate with deliberate sensuality. Grapes were pressed to lips, wine poured in thin streams, hands brushed, accidentally, across arms. Behind laughter and toasts, eyes lingered. Every meal was a theater of temptation, food, wealth, and flesh blurring into a single ritual of dominance and desire. The emperors understood this performance better than anyone. Augustus, the architect of morality, cloaked his power in modesty, a seduction through restraint. He presented himself as a man of virtue, a father of the nation, a model of piety. But beneath that carefully composed image was a mastery of perception, a recognition that purity itself could be erotic when wielded with precision. The people loved him not for his conquests alone, but for the illusion that he desired nothing. In denying pleasure publicly, he consumed it privately, in gardens hidden from view, surrounded by dancers, poets, and the perfumed glow of lamplight. Others were less discreet. Nero, whose passions were legend, turned the empire into his stage. He dressed in silk, painted his lips, and performed before crowds like a demigod of art and vice. His palaces were filled with mirrors and fountains, rooms that reflected and refracted his own image endlessly. To love Nero, or to fear him, was to be drawn into a labyrinth of spectacle. His power was performative, his cruelty theatrical. He seduced not through beauty but through excess, through the hypnotic pull of chaos itself. The empire watched, horrified yet unable to look away, as its ruler turned Rome into an empire of reflection, every subject, willingly or not, caught in his gaze. In that era, to adorn oneself was political. Jewelry was not ornament but statement. The curve of a bracelet, the shimmer of a gem, all carried meaning. A senator's wife wore her pearls as Rome wore its provinces, in conquest. The Empress Livia, wife of Augustus, was said to embody chastity in public and command in private. Her calm eyes could still a room, her words, soft as silk, could unmake a man's career. She was the embodiment of Rome's new kind of seduction, one that concealed power behind virtue, that ruled through suggestion rather than force. And beyond the marble palaces, in the lower quarters of the city, a different empire of seduction thrived. In the Subura, the air was thick with perfume and smoke, with the laughter of courtesans and the music of flutes. The prostitutes of Rome were not merely bodies for sale, they were interpreters of desire, historians of hunger. Some were slaves, others freed women, others yet high-class hetairai who entertained senators and poets. Their chambers were small temples of pleasure, hung with drapes, lit by flickering lamps that made every shadow tremble like breath. Here, power reversed itself. The men who commanded legions found themselves begging for tenderness, for the illusion of surrender. The courtesan, for an hour, became the goddess of his world. Among them were the meretresses doctae, learned courtesans who recited poetry, debated philosophy, and wielded charm as deftly as wit. They understood what few men dared to admit, that power and vulnerability were twins, and that true seduction lay in their balance. Some became muses to the poets, Tibullus, Propertius, Ovid. Through them, the literature of the empire was infused with longing and irony, with the ache of pleasures both forbidden and divine. When Ovid wrote Ars Amatoria, the art of love, he did not merely teach romance, he codified empire's erotic philosophy. To seduce was to conquer, but gently, with rhythm, with patience, with theater. To be desired was to possess influence. To yield was sometimes to rule. The boundaries of this erotic imagination stretched even into religion. The statues of gods and goddesses were carved not as abstractions but as bodies of impossible perfection, Jupiter with his eternal youth, Apollo radiant with grace, Venus soft and sensuous, Mars strong and untamed. Worship was an act of admiration that bordered on lust. The divine body became the mirror by which mortals judged themselves. To kiss the feet of a statue, to caress its marble curve, was not sacrilege but reverence. The line between prayer and desire dissolved completely. And so, the empire turned itself into a living myth, every citizen both participant and spectator in the grand seduction of Rome. Its architecture reflected the same philosophy. Columns rose like limbs, domes curved like breasts, arches framed the sky like lips parted in invitation. The city itself was designed to arouse awe, devotion, desire. To walk through its streets was to be touched by history, to feel the weight of 1,000 gazes lingering on one's shoulders. Rome did not simply rule the world, it made the world love it. The games, too, were part of this language. The gladiator's body, glistening with sweat beneath the sun, became an object of fascination. Strength was erotic, and death, the ultimate seduction. The crowd watched, their hearts pounding, as blades flashed and blood spilled upon sand. In the moment of victory, the survivor stood over his fallen foe, chest heaving, muscles taut, eyes alight. The emperor, watching from his gilded seat, raised or lowered his thumb, a gesture that determined life or death. Even in violence, there was theater, there was ritual, there was seduction. The roar of the crowd was not mere excitement, it was communion, the collective surrender of will to spectacle. Power, pleasure, death, the triad upon which Rome built its dominion, all merged beneath the skin of empire. And within that merging lay its greatest secret, that seduction, in its truest form, was never about possession. It was about transformation, the power to make others feel, to draw them into your gravity until they could no longer tell where they ended and you began. Rome did this to the world. It drew nations, beliefs, bodies, and dreams into itself, until the empire's heart beat in every conquered chest. But even the most intoxicating seduction carries its own undoing. For when desire becomes empire, and empire becomes desire, one no longer knows what is worshipped, the god, the ruler, or the self. And in that confusion, something begins to tremble beneath the marble, a quiet crack in the illusion of eternity. The empire dreamed of itself through its stories, its portraits, its marble. Rome's most intoxicating myth was not that it ruled the world, but that the world wished to be ruled by it. From the Palatine to the provinces, Roman identity became a performance of grace and domination. The empire seduced its subjects not through constant violence but through fascination, through the shimmer of its culture, its architecture, its promises of immortality. To become Roman was to be touched by beauty. To resist Rome was to refuse desire itself. In that sense, the empire's greatest conquest was psychological. It taught the world to crave its own submission. At the heart of this empire stood the emperor, not merely a ruler, but the embodiment of Rome's erotic imagination. His image, multiplied on coins, statues, and frescoes, was both political and devotional. The tilt of his chin, the curve of his neck, the absence of flaw, these were not accidents of artistry. Sculptors shaped him to represent a nation's longing, an ideal made flesh. Citizens touched these images with reverent fingers, whispered prayers, felt the smoothness of marble as though it might pulse beneath their palms. Power, after all, was a kind of beauty, and beauty a kind of power. To adore the emperor's form was to affirm the order of the cosmos. But not all emperors inspired love through restraint. Some ruled by spectacle. In the golden corridors of the Palatine Hill, banquets unfolded that blurred the line between ceremony and dream. Oil lamps painted the ceilings with trembling light. Garlands of roses, imported from the deserts of Syria, perfumed the air so thickly that guests spoke of dizziness, of visions. Musicians played soft dissonances on strings and flutes while dancers moved among the tables like spirits, neither courtesans nor servants, but symbols of the empire's abundance. The emperor reclined upon cushions dyed in Tyrian purple, his robe slipping to reveal the gleam of gold-threaded fabric beneath. Everything shimmered, wine, laughter, the surface of power itself. These gatherings were more than indulgence. They were political theater. Invitations were currency, glances contracts. To be noticed by the emperor was to be marked, either for favor or for ruin. In this world, charm was a weapon sharper than steel. A smile could purchase an army's loyalty, a rumor could end a dynasty. The palace whisper was the pulse of the empire. Even silence had meaning. The absence of words could suggest intimacy or betrayal. In such spaces, the body became a code, every motion deliberate, every expression rehearsed. Yet beneath the pageantry, Rome's elite were haunted by the same yearning as the humblest citizen, the need to be seen, to be desired, to be immortalized. To exist in Rome was to crave visibility. The statues that lined the Forum were not only monuments to greatness but embodiments of the city's philosophy, that to endure, one must become art. Death might claim the flesh, but marble could preserve the illusion of vitality. Even the inscriptions beneath these figures often spoke in the first person, as though the stone itself still breathed. I was loved. I ruled. I lived forever in the gaze of others. Poets gave this longing voice. In the verses of Ovid, Horace, and Propertius, the empire's erotic consciousness found its rhythm. Love was treated as strategy, seduction as empire in miniature. A lover's conquest mirrored a general's campaign: patience, deception, surrender, glory. The metaphors of war and desire became indistinguishable. A sigh could be a declaration, a glance, an invasion. Through poetry, the private became public, the body politicized, the act of longing transformed into language. Rome sang to itself in tones of both pride and melancholy, knowing that the fire which illuminated also consumed. For in every triumph of power there is a shadow, the fear of loss. The Romans, despite their confidence, understood impermanence. They built their monuments to defy it, but their hearts could not escape it. The same city that exalted pleasure was obsessed with decay. In frescoes buried beneath volcanic ash, faces are frozen mid-smile, eternal, but mute. In the forums, statues eroded by time's breath stand like ghosts of desire turned to dust. The empire's beauty was haunted by its awareness that nothing, no glory, no flesh, could resist the erosion of years. Perhaps that is why Rome adored excess, because it sensed that to live intensely, even briefly, was to cheat eternity. Among philosophers, this anxiety took the form of reflection. The Stoics preached discipline, but beneath their calm surfaces ran a quiet terror of the passions that could unmake empires. Seneca wrote that desire, ungoverned, turned rulers into slaves of their appetites. Yet even he admired beauty, in nature, in reason, in the perfect alignment of moral and physical grace. The philosopher's dream was not to extinguish desire but to refine it, to transform it into virtue. In this sense, the Stoic too was a seducer, seeking harmony through restraint, perfection through tension. The soul's composure was its allure. Still, the empire thrived on paradox. For every philosopher of moderation, there was an artist of abandon. The fresco painters of Pompeii filled their walls with visions of mythic passion, gods entwined, mortals reaching toward the divine. The colors, even now, whisper of heat and movement, of the thin veil between devotion and hunger. To stand before those walls was to enter the Roman psyche, beautiful, ordered, trembling with desire beneath its discipline. The cult of personality reached its height under emperors who understood that spectacle could replace faith. To appear radiant was to seem divine. To be loved was to be obeyed. Temples were erected to the living ruler, incense burned before his image, hymns sung in his honor. Some believed these rituals empty, others believed them sacred. Either way, they bound the empire together in a shared illusion, that power, like beauty, could be eternal. But illusions are fragile things. The more Rome adorned its emperors, the more it risked worshipping shadows. The real man vanished beneath the image. The empire fell in love with its own reflection. In private letters, courtiers wrote of exhaustion, not physical, but spiritual. The endless pageants, the competitions of wit and charm, the fear of losing favor, all left them hollow. They had mastered the art of appearance but forgotten the substance beneath. To feel was dangerous, to appear to feel was required. Love itself became a form of performance, measured by gifts and gestures, by poetry and rumor. Yet behind the masks, some longed for authenticity, for a touch not given in calculation, for words not weighed in politics. They found refuge in gardens at night, under cypress and laurel, where conversation softened into honesty and laughter shed its armor. Even in an empire built on seduction, sincerity was the rarest pleasure of all. Beyond the palaces, the common people carried their own rituals of desire. Lovers met at fountains, left tokens at shrines, scratched names into walls that still whisper across centuries. These small gestures of affection, carved into stone, outlasted dynasties. In their simplicity, they defied the grandeur of emperors. Where politics turned seduction into power, the people turned it into memory. Their graffiti, their humble verses, spoke of what the empire itself could not, that love, stripped of ornament, was the one force that neither marble nor gold could contain. The myth of Rome's invincibility began to tremble not through invasion, but through fatigue. The empire had seduced the world so completely that it no longer knew how to desire honestly. Its spectacles grew louder, its pleasures more extravagant, as though noise could drown the silence spreading beneath. The people still watched, still applauded, still adored, but the adoration was hollow, ritual without reverence. Even the gods seemed distant, their temples echoing with unanswered prayers. In this emptiness, new faiths began to stir, quieter, humbler, speaking of salvation through simplicity rather than splendor. They whispered that the soul, not the body, was sacred. To a civilization drunk on beauty, this was a sobering truth. And yet, Rome's legacy endured precisely because of its contradictions. The empire that worshipped power also invented tenderness. The society that glorified conquest also built baths, libraries, theaters, and gardens. Its vision of the body, radiant, mortal, divine, continued to haunt the imagination of centuries. Every marble statue, every dome, every painting of light upon skin carries Rome's shadow. We still speak its language of allure and ambition, of beauty as persuasion. We inherit its paradox, to desire transcendence, yet to find it only through the senses. As night descended on the empire's final centuries, the lamps of its great houses still burned. The last poet still wrote verses to vanished lovers, the last emperors still posed as gods. In their decline, they clung to ritual, to the slow pouring of wine, to the shimmer of silk, to the sound of lyres echoing through colonnades. They believed that if they could keep the performance alive, the dream would not end. And in a sense, they were right. For the empire of seduction did not die, it transformed. Its pulse moved into art, into religion, into the human imagination itself. To this day, when we gaze upon ruins, we feel that same strange pull, a mix of admiration and melancholy, attraction and dread. We sense what the Romans knew, that beauty is both revelation and warning. The same flame that illuminates also consumes. The empire's marble may have crumbled, but its allure remains intact, shimmering faintly through time, whispering that to desire is to live, and to live is always to stand on the edge of loss. And so, beneath the silent arches of history, the spirit of Rome still lingers, not as empire, but as echo, not as body, but as memory of touch. The empire of seduction never truly ended. It merely changed its form, slipping from marble to flesh, from ruler to artist, from temple to mind. The world, even now, continues to dream the dream Rome first imagined, that power can be made beautiful, and beauty can rule the world. The empire did not end in a single night. It dimmed, slowly, imperceptibly, like a lamp whose oil has grown thin. The marble still gleamed beneath the sun, the fountains still murmured in their basins, the temples still smelled faintly of incense and warm dust. Yet something had changed. Rome, once intoxicated by its own reflection, began to avert its gaze. The air grew heavier, the laughter of its people subdued, the murals of its villas faded to pale ghosts of color. A new language whispered through the streets, one not of conquest or beauty, but of repentance. The empire that had once worshipped pleasure now began to fear it. It started, as all transformations do, in the mind. Philosophers who had once spoken of moderation now preached abstinence. Artists who once painted love scenes turned to visions of death and judgment. Even the poets, whose words had once danced like wine over the tongue, began to sound weary, their verses slower, heavier, as though choked by a century of indulgence. The erotic imagination that had once built temples to Venus and Bacchus was now turning inward, uneasy beneath the weight of its own excess. Desire, once divine, began to carry the scent of guilt. The streets that had echoed with music now rang with sermons. In courtyards once dedicated to laughter and feasting, men and women gathered to confess the burden of their pleasure. New prophets rose from the dust of the provinces, men of ragged robes and burning eyes, who spoke of sin, of purity, of the body as a battlefield between flesh and spirit. Their words spread like wildfire through the crumbling avenues. They spoke to a people who had grown tired of the endless pursuit of delight, tired of being seduced by an empire that could no longer sustain its own fantasy. Pleasure, they said, was the chain that bound humanity to decay. The old gods grew silent. Statues once garlanded in flowers stood neglected, their eyes filled with rainwater. Temples, their roofs cracked and columns leaning, became places of unease. The offerings ceased. The priests, once adorned in gold, now walked barefoot through empty sanctuaries. The festivals, once wild and luminous, were whispered about with shame. The orgies that had symbolized abundance and communion were now spoken of as sickness. A new morality had begun to seep through the empire's bones, cold and heavy as winter fog. In the palaces, even emperors began to feel the tremor. The luxury that had once been a symbol of divine right now appeared grotesque, excessive, obscene. Some rulers turned to asceticism, renouncing their own banquets, destroying the statues of their predecessors, banning the games and the dances that once drew the people together in ecstasy. Others clung more tightly to decadence, as though by feasting they could defy the growing tide of restraint. But decadence without belief is hollow, and indulgence without joy soon curdles into despair. The empire, once radiant with pleasure, now trembled beneath the weight of its own disillusionment. In private, people began to look inward. The baths, once places of community and flotation, became places of silence. The fountains no longer reflected laughter but introspection. Citizens who once celebrated the naked form now covered themselves in modest fabrics. The body, once celebrated as divine art, became a reminder of corruption. Artists, unable to abandon beauty entirely, began to paint it differently, shadowed, sorrowful, wounded. The divine lovers of old myths were replaced by saints, martyrs, and angels, figures who desired not flesh but transcendence. The empire's palette darkened, its music slowed. The rhythm of its heart began to shift from ecstasy to penitence. There was fear in this transformation, not of external enemies, but of the self. The Romans, once masters of their appetites, began to see temptation as invasion, pleasure as weakness, passion as sin. This fear gave birth to new hierarchies of purity. Those who renounced the world, who fasted, who prayed, who denied the body, were revered as holy. The sensual, the joyful, the curious were branded as fallen. The same empire that had once worshipped Venus now sought salvation in suffering. The pendulum swung from indulgence to denial, from marble baths to stone monasteries, from the perfume of roses to the scent of ashes. Yet beneath this new morality lingered the ghost of the old. Even as people turned from pleasure, they could not forget it. The memory of silk, of laughter, of warm skin beneath lamplight, it haunted their prayers. The monks who fled to the desert to escape temptation found that temptation followed them in dreams. The more they tried to renounce the body, the more vividly the body returned, shimmering like a mirage in the heat. Denial, in its extremity, became a new form of desire. The very effort to kill pleasure gave birth to a subtler, more dangerous kind, the pleasure of restraint, of control, of suffering itself. This transformation did not happen without pain. Families divided over faith. Temples were destroyed or converted into churches. Statues were defaced, their perfect marble faces shattered by the fury of zealots who saw in them the reflection of forbidden beauty. The city that had once celebrated every form of life now recoiled from it. Yet even as the old world crumbled, something tender emerged from its ruins, a new vision of love, stripped of ornament, grounded in compassion rather than possession. It was fragile, trembling, uncertain. But it carried within it the seed of a different kind of ecstasy. As Rome's political power waned, its spiritual gravity deepened. The empire fell, but its soul transformed. The city that had once ruled through desire now ruled through faith. The sensual and the sacred had not vanished, they had merely traded places. Pleasure became sin, and suffering became grace. The same intensity that had once built orgiastic temples now built cathedrals. The same yearning that had once reached for flesh now reached for the divine. The human hunger for transcendence, whether through love, art, or pain, remained unbroken. The ruins of the old temples stood as silent witnesses to this metamorphosis. Moss crept over the stones, ivy wound through the columns. Birds nested in the hollowed eyes of forgotten gods. In the evenings, as the last light of day gilded the crumbling statues, one could almost feel the past breathing, the ghosts of laughter, the echo of music, the faint perfume of vanished flowers. The earth remembered what the mind tried to forget. Beneath every church lay a temple, beneath every prayer, a pulse. The sacred and the profane had become inseparable. The people, too, carried this duality. They prayed with their lips while dreaming with their hearts. They spoke of purity but longed for warmth. They confessed their sins with tears that felt strangely like relief. The human spirit, torn between heaven and earth, began to define itself by this tension. Out of guilt grew art, out of restraint, beauty. The frescoes that once adorned pagan villas were reborn in Christian sanctuaries, softer, dimmer, yet still luminous with longing. Angels replaced courtesans, saints replaced lovers. But the gaze remained the same, that same Roman gaze, heavy with awareness, yearning, and sorrow. And so, as the centuries turned, the empire of pleasure dissolved into the empire of the soul. The marble that once celebrated the body now framed the sacred. The sensuality of line and form endured, but its meaning shifted. The divine was no longer found in touch, but in absence, not in possession, but in devotion. The same human hunger, forever unquenched, found a new language, the language of prayer, of art, of yearning that transcended the flesh but could never quite forget it. The world moved on. Empires rose and fell, faiths clashed and merged, philosophies flickered and died. Yet through it all, the echo of Rome's great transformation endured. The fall of ecstasy was not the death of desire, but its evolution, from flesh to spirit, from spectacle to silence, from the visible to the unseen. The Romans, even in their decline, had discovered a truth that still binds us, that every civilization must confront its own hunger, and every act of denial is only another form of longing. The transformation of Rome was not merely architectural or political, it was psychic. Beneath the crumbling marble and shifting faiths, something more intimate was unfolding, a redefinition of the human self. The old gods had dwelt among mortals, laughing, loving, punishing, and feasting. They were imperfect, passionate, alive. In their departure, something essential was lost. The divine became distant, abstract, cloaked in silence. The world grew colder, its mysteries sharpened into doctrines, its desires caged by confession. Humanity, once embraced by its gods, now stood apart from them, staring into the void of eternity with a new kind of loneliness. The temples fell, but their spirit remained, buried beneath layers of sanctity. The same hands that had carved Venus now shaped Mary, the same craftsmen who once adorned baksheesh shrines with vines and grapes now painted halos and tears. The sensual precision of Rome could not vanish, it merely changed its focus. Beauty survived the fall of ecstasy, but it wore a new mask. The soft curves of divinity persisted, but they were now wrapped in robes, their gestures more restrained, their eyes turned upward. Yet behind that upward gaze was still the echo of the body, the quiet memory of warmth, of breath, of touch. In the monasteries that began to rise across the fading empire, a different kind of passion took root. Men and women withdrew from the cities, from the pleasures of the world, seeking purity in silence and solitude. Yet even there, desire whispered. In the stillness of cloisters, monks dreamed of the lives they had renounced. Their prayers trembled with longing. In their attempts to extinguish desire, they found themselves haunted by it. The human spirit, it seemed, could not be separated from its yearning. To live was to ache. Their visions of the divine became visions of beauty so intense that it bordered on sensual, radiant light, divine embraces, celestial music that stirred the soul like a lover's breath. They sought heaven, but in doing so, they rediscovered the language of pleasure, sanctified, transformed, yet unmistakably human. This was the paradox of Rome's afterlife. In fleeing from the body, it immortalized it. The very faith that condemned lust gave birth to art so charged with tenderness and devotion that it rivaled the orgiastic mosaics of old. Churches became the new theaters of ecstasy. Light streamed through stained glass like divine wine. Choirs rose in harmony, voices blending with such aching beauty that listeners wept. In fresco and sculpture, the suffering of saints was rendered with an almost erotic precision, the arch of a neck, the tears glistening on a cheek, the exposed wound glowing as though kissed by flame. Pain became the new pleasure, sacrifice the new seduction. The people, meanwhile, learned to carry their desire inward. In the absence of public revelry, the imagination became the new arena of excess. Dreams, visions, prayers, all became forms of inward theater. The festivals of the flesh were replaced by the feasts of the mind. Yet the body, though suppressed, did not disappear. It lived on in the shadows of consciousness, in secret confessions, in the trembling of hands clasped in prayer. The tension between spirit and flesh, guilt and longing, became the pulse of an entire civilization. Rome had not conquered its passions, it had refined them into instruments of devotion. This transformation spread like a tide across centuries. The language of desire was rewritten, but its rhythm endured. Where once the Romans had sung hymns to Venus, now they sang to the Virgin, different words, same cadence of reverence. The statues of Christ's suffering echoed the gestures of fallen heroes. Even the architecture of the new faith retained the geometry of the old, arches, columns, domes, only now, they reached not toward pleasure, but toward salvation. Yet to walk through those cathedrals was still to feel awe, still to sense the sensual majesty of space and light. The divine remained a form of seduction, though now its touch was more subtle, its promise deferred to eternity. The poets of this new era, descendants of those who had once written odes to lovers and wine, now wrote hymns of devotion. But their words, beneath the piety, carried the same tremor of longing. To love God was still to desire union, still to ache for the impossible. The erotic and the spiritual merged into one. Mystics described their communion with the divine in language so vivid that it seemed almost carnal, hearts pierced by love, souls consumed by fire, ecstasy as revelation. The same intoxication that had once filled the temples now filled the cells of saints. The body, denied, had become the soul's metaphor. Outside the cloisters, the world darkened. The empire's borders collapsed, its cities fell into ruin. The great baths became hollow shells, filled with silence and dust. Statues lay broken in the streets, their faces worn smooth by time. Yet amid the decay, life endured, quieter, humbler, but still luminous. Farmers tilled fields that grew over old battlefields, children played among fallen columns, shepherds led their flocks through the remains of amphitheaters where once emperors had watched the games. The grandeur of Rome had dissolved into the earth, but its essence remained, woven into the soil, the language, the art, the human soul. Centuries passed. The memory of Rome's orgies faded into myth, its pleasures recast as cautionary tales. But every age that came after carried a flicker of its light. The Renaissance, with its rediscovery of ancient art, was not merely a revival of form, it was a rekindling of desire. The artists who studied the fragments of Roman sculpture saw in them not just technique, but passion, the human longing for beauty that refuses to die. They painted bodies again, not in shame but in reverence. They carved flesh out of stone once more. The divine and the sensual, once enemies, were reunited in marble and pigment. Rome's fall, then, was not an ending but a metamorphosis, a long and painful birth of restraint, of introspection, of the complex dance between guilt and grace. Its ecstasy had not vanished, it had transformed into a deeper awareness, a slow, meditative hunger that would shape the Western soul for millennia. The legacy of the empire was not its armies or its laws, but its capacity to feel, to explore the full range of human desire, from the flesh to the infinite. Even now, when we walk through its ruins, we feel both awe and unease. The stones seem to breathe, whispering of pleasures too vast, too dangerous, too sacred to name. The broken columns are not merely remnants of architecture but fragments of human longing, frozen gestures of hands that once reached toward the divine through the body. The silence of the ruins is not empty, it hums with memory. Beneath the dust lies the pulse of centuries, slow and steady, as though the earth itself remembers the rhythm of ancient hearts. At dusk, when the light fades and the air turns cool, one might imagine that Rome still dreams. Somewhere beneath the ground, beneath layers of ruin and faith, the old gods stir in their sleep. They do not rage against the new order, they merely wait, patient as marble, for the next awakening. For the story of desire is not linear. It rises and falls like breath, like empire, like tide. Humanity forgets and remembers, represses and resurrects. The ecstasy that fell in Rome will rise again elsewhere, in art, in thought, in the quiet yearning of the soul that refuses to be silenced. And perhaps that is the true lesson of the empire's fall, that restraint is never the end of pleasure, but its evolution. That guilt is merely another mask for longing. That beneath every renunciation lies the same eternal question: to what do we give ourselves? To the body? To the spirit? To both, intertwined? Rome's greatest gift to history was not its conquest of nations, but its unveiling of this truth, that pleasure and holiness are not opposites, but reflections of one another. The empire's ruins are mirrors. To gaze upon them is to see ourselves, our contradictions, our desires, our fears. We, too, live in the echo of Rome's struggle, torn between indulgence and restraint, between the hunger for beauty and the terror of decay. We build and destroy, feast and repent, fall and rise again, always seeking balance between the sacred and the sensual. The story continues, written not in stone now, but in our hearts, in our art, in the fragile architectures of our own desires. And so the empire of ecstasy ends, not with collapse, but with transformation. The flames that once lit its feasts now burn quietly within us, as memory, as yearning, as the faint shimmer of something both forbidden and divine. The marble has cracked, but the pulse remains. The gods are silent, but their breath still stirs the air at twilight. Rome is gone, and yet, in every act of creation, every whisper of longing, every trembling recognition of beauty, it lives. Night drapes itself over the ruins of Rome like a veil of smoke. The city is quieter now than it ever was in life, and yet beneath its stillness one feels something breathing, something old, patient, and aware. The wind drifts through the hollow eyes of broken statues, whispering through marble ribs and fluted columns, carrying the faint scent of dust and time. It is a breath not quite human, a slow exhalation from the earth itself, as though the soil remembers the weight of empires, the laughter of banquets, the cry of prayer, the sigh of lovers. To walk among these ruins after dusk is to feel surrounded by ghosts that do not speak but hum, a sound too low to be heard, too deep to be forgotten. Here, history is not written but murmured. The stones do not tell stories directly, they hum with the residue of them. A fragment of arch, a handless statue, a mosaic floor hidden beneath weeds, each is an echo of what the world once desired. The marble remembers touch, the walls remember sound, and the air remembers scent. What was once an empire of flesh has become an empire of memory. And yet, memory is a kind of life, one that transcends death, one that lingers like perfume long after the body has vanished. The night deepens. Moonlight slides along the ruins, tracing the curve of columns as though caressing them. It feels almost tender, as if the moon, eternal witness of human folly, still grieves for what was lost here. The Tiber glints faintly below, its waters dark as ink, whispering to itself as it moves through the sleeping city. Once, it bore the weight of marble and blood, gold and grain, the commerce of the world. Now it carries only reflection. But even reflection can be sacred, for the water, like the soul, never forgets what it has touched. To stand here is to feel the convergence of all things, body and spirit, faith and hunger, ruin and resurrection. The Rome of stone and empire has passed, but another Rome endures, invisible, internal, beating within every civilization that came after. Its architecture became metaphor, its passions became theology, its ruins became scripture written in dust. Every age, knowingly or not, walks in its shadow. The very tension between sin and sanctity, indulgence and restraint, that still shapes our hearts began here, beneath these fallen domes, these worn mosaics, these eternal eyes of marble. We tell ourselves that history moves forward, but in truth it circles, like the planets Rome once charted in its temples. Every rise carries the seed of decline, every denial the seed of rediscovery. The Roman world of ecstasy gave way to guilt, but guilt in turn rekindled the dream of beauty. Even now, our museums and cathedrals hum with the same contradictory music, a hymn that begins in desire and ends in transcendence. We are the inheritors of that music, whether we hear it or not. The soul of Rome lies not in conquest but in contradiction. It taught humanity that the sacred and the profane are not enemies but mirrors, that every yearning for the divine begins in the flesh, and every act of faith ends in longing. The early Christians who prayed in catacombs beneath pagan temples were not escaping the old world, they were continuing it, reshaping its language into new symbols. Their saints became the new Venus, their martyrs the new heroes. Even the cross, stark, simple, stripped of ornament, carried the same vertical aspiration as the columns of Jupiter's temple. Rome could not truly die, for it had already woven itself into the grammar of human imagination. Walk long enough through the ruins and you begin to hear it, the soft pulse beneath the silence, the rhythm of centuries still alive. It is the sound of the eternal human story repeating itself, the desire to reach beyond the body, and the inevitable return to it. The monks who denied the flesh, the poets who worshipped it, the lovers who lived and died in its shadow, all part of the same vast circle. To renounce desire is merely to express it differently. To worship is to long. To long is to live. And yet, how fragile this balance remains. The modern traveler, standing among these fragments, might feel both reverence and guilt. We build differently now, with glass instead of marble, with electricity instead of flame, but the same hunger drives us. We crave beauty that consoles, power that redeems, touch that transcends. Our cities rise higher, but our shadows lengthen. The same conflict Rome faced, between ecstasy and restraint, between pleasure and purpose, still breathes within us. We have only changed the language. The ancient feast has become the digital glare, the public forum the glowing screen, the whisper of faith the hum of machines. But the longing remains unchanged. In this way, Rome's echo is not history at all, but prophecy. Its ruins foretell not only its own fall but ours, the moment when beauty becomes burden, when abundance turns to fatigue, when we mistake spectacle for meaning. Yet within that prophecy lies a kind of hope, too. For every fall births reflection, and every ruin invites rebirth. Rome teaches that no ecstasy is lost forever, it only sleeps, awaiting the courage to rise again. The night wind passes again through the ruins, cooler now, tinged with the scent of rain. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls, slow, solemn, resonant. The sound lingers in the air, blending with the rustle of leaves and the murmuring water. It is both elegy and invocation, farewell and awakening. Perhaps the bell is tolling for Rome. Or perhaps it tolls for all of us, for every civilization that builds its temples of desire, only to watch them fall, and then build again, always reaching, always yearning. Above, the stars will in their endless order, serene, untouched. The constellations the Romans named, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, still glitter in their ancient positions, indifferent to our rises and declines. They are the same lights that shone upon the first feast, the first prayer, the first act of love. Their cold brilliance reminds us that we are both fleeting and eternal, dust in motion, passion wrapped in bone. What the Romans knew, what they felt in their bones and blood, is that to be human is to burn brightly against the darkness for as long as the oil lasts. And when the lamp goes out, the flame continues in another form, memory, art, story, faith. The empire may crumble, but the desire that built it cannot. For even now, when one kneels in a cathedral or gazes upon a sculpture, or touches another hand in the dim quiet of evening, Rome is there, not as empire, but as echo. Its ghosts are gentle now, their laughter softened by time. They do not haunt to frighten, but to remind, that all beauty is borrowed, all pleasure sacred, all faith born of longing. They whisper that the fall of ecstasy was never truly a fall, but a descent into deeper mystery, into the silence where the divine and the human meet, where every sigh becomes prayer, and every prayer a sigh. Dawn comes slowly to Rome. It always has. The first light does not pierce but seeps, a pale wash of gold that rolls gently over rooftops, across arches, through the hollow ribs of the Forum. It does not erase the night's mysteries, only softens them, like breath upon a mirror. The ruins look almost alive in that moment, fragile, trembling, and strangely beautiful. The columns stand not as remnants of loss, but as witnesses of endurance. Their shadows stretch like fingers across the marble floors where priests, emperors, and lovers once walked. For a moment, it feels as though the whole city exhales, remembering itself. Somewhere beneath the cobblestones, beneath centuries of dust and prayer, lie the ashes of those who once believed that pleasure was a path to the divine. They are anonymous now, citizens, slaves, courtesans, mystics, all return to the same silence. Yet in that silence, something hums, the echo of touch, the ghost of breath. These are not merely the dead of history, they are the keepers of memory. The pulse of every modern heart carries their rhythm, faint but unbroken. When we seek beauty, when we tremble in awe, when we love, we awaken them. The empire never truly fell. It was absorbed. Perhaps this is what Rome always intended, not conquest by sword or creed, but through sensation. The marble survives not because it is strong, but because it remembers how to receive light. Its endurance is not in defiance, but in surrender. In the same way, the spirit endures not by resisting desire but by allowing it to transform. The Romans, in all their contradictions, understood this. They built monuments to gods who mirrored human flaws, and in doing so made the sacred feel reachable. Their rituals of flesh were also rituals of faith, their indulgence a form of worship. They blurred every boundary we later tried to define, between sin and sanctity, between ecstasy and prayer. Now, standing amid their echoes, we see what they could not, how every civilization carves its own reflection into time. The temples we build today, of glass, of technology, of data, are still altars to longing. We may no longer anoint ourselves in oil or wine, but in the glow of screens, the ritual continues. The gestures have changed, the yearning has not. We crave connection, illumination, transcendence. We seek to feel alive in a world that grows ever more mechanical. In that search, we are as Roman as the ancients we pretend to surpass. The true fall of Rome was not its ruin but its forgetting, when marble became metaphor, when desire became guilt. And yet, in every renaissance, every act of creation, Rome rises again. It rises in art, in love, in rebellion against the sterile and the cold. It rises each time someone refuses to believe that pleasure is shameful, that the body is a prison, that beauty must be earned through suffering. The Roman soul survives wherever humanity dares to celebrate itself without apology. But survival is not triumph. It is confession. For even as Rome endures in our stories and architecture, it also reminds us of our limits, the cost of excess, the fragility of grandeur. It asks us, gently, what we will do with our own empire of the self. Will we worship at the altar of indulgence until it collapses beneath its own weight? Or will we learn from the ruins and build something quieter, more enduring, a beauty that does not consume but consoles? The answer lies somewhere in between. Every human heart holds both the temple and the tavern, both prayer and appetite. The balance is never permanent, it sways like a flame in the wind. The Romans lived within that tension, and so do we. To deny it is to erase the essence of what it means to be alive. To embrace it is to accept that holiness may dwell not only in abstinence, but in touch, that every act of love is also an act of creation, fleeting yet eternal. The city brightens now. Morning spills fully over the Palatine hill, and the stones begin to warm. Birds return to perch on the same arches where ravens once watched emperors die. The air smells faintly of cypress and rain. Somewhere, a church bell rings again, the same one, perhaps, that tolled through the night. Its echo rises over the ruins, over the river, over the centuries. And in that sound, the world folds into itself, pagan and Christian, ancient and modern, sacred and profane, all dissolving into one continuous breath. Listen closely, and you might hear the murmur beneath it, the heartbeat of the eternal city, slow but unwavering. It is the pulse of all who ever lived and loved here, and of all who ever will. The empire of pleasure, the empire of faith, the empire of memory, they are one and the same. Their borders blur in the half-light, where marble meets dust, where desire meets devotion. And there, in that trembling balance, humanity endures, fragile, radiant, unrepentant. Rome sleeps, but it does not die. It dreams through us.